If you put a rat in a restraining device or you put them in a pool of water that they can't escape from, and you give another rat the opportunity to open the restraining device or to open a door that lets the other rat out of the pool of water, they'll do that. And they'll do that even if they don't know the other rat, and even if they have no opportunity to interact with them after rescuing them. So it's not that they're just selfishly motivated by a desire for social interaction. When one monkey got a grape and the other got a cucumber, the monkey who got the cucumber would refuse to eat it and would often throw it out of the cage or throw it at the experimenter. So clearly they were really upset that they got a cucumber when the other monkey got a grape, which is a much more highly valued reward. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Mickey Pardo. I'm a biologist with a PhD in animal behavior from Cornell University, and I've been studying animal behavior and ecology for more than 15 years. So today I wanted to talk about whether non-human animals have a moral compass. In other words, do they have an internal sense of right and wrong? And a lot of people assume that morality is something that's unique to humans. And in fact, this is often used as a justification for why only humans deserve moral consideration and legal rights, or at the very least, why we deserve greater moral consideration than other species. Personally, I think this view that you only deserve equal moral consideration if you yourself have a sense of right and wrong is deeply problematic, because I think it would, if we follow it to its logical conclusion, it would mean that very young children, and in some cases people with certain intellectual disabilities, would deserve less moral consideration than other people. And I certainly hope that most of us agree that children and intellectually disabled adults matter just as much as everybody else. So by the same token, I don't think that we can use whether or not non-human animals have a moral compass as a justification for giving them less moral consideration than we give to humans. But regardless, it's still a very interesting question of whether or not non-human animals have a sense of morality. And so that's what I wanted to talk about in this video. So before we can talk about whether or not animals have morality, we first have to define what morality is. And a lot of people have proposed different definitions for it. It's kind of a slippery concept to define, but I'm going to use a framework in this video called moral foundations theory. And moral foundations theory was developed primarily by psychologists Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham. And it proposes that our sense of morality, our internal sense of right and wrong, essentially boils down to a series of moral foundations, which are basically emotions that dictate how we determine whether a particular action feels right or wrong to us. The original version of moral foundations theory included 5 moral foundations, and since then, some additional ones have been added. So the original 5 were care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. And then another one that's often added is liberty, and then there's some additional ones that have been proposed as well. So I'll walk through each of these in turn. So care is basically our sense of empathy, and it's the foundation for why we feel that harming others is wrong. Fairness is basically our sense of justice, and different people have slightly different conceptions of what it means to be fair. So, for example, people who are more left-leaning politically tend to view fairness in terms of treating everybody equally, whereas people who are more right-leaning tend to view fairness more in terms of treating everyone in accordance with their merit. But regardless, basically all humans have a sense of fairness. Loyalty is the sense that we have an extra obligation to take care of the people who are close to us in some way, whether that's family and friends, members of our tribe, our countrymen, or whatever. Authority is the sense that we should respect our leaders, our elders, and our cultural traditions. And purity is a moral foundation that is based on underlying feelings of disgust. So this explains, for example, why many people feel that incest is always morally wrong, even if it's between two consenting adults of the same age. And then liberty is essentially the feeling of resentment that people feel when somebody tries to dominate them or tell them what to do. Most people care about all of these moral foundations to at least some degree, but the degree to which people value each of the moral foundations depends a lot on their cultural background and their political persuasion. And in fact, you can take a quiz that will tell you how you rank the different moral foundations and how much they matter to you. And actually, maybe a fun thing to do would be to take the quiz and then let me know in the comments what results you got. And if I get at least 25 comments of people posting their results, then I'll put my own results in the comments as well. So this is an overgeneralization, but at least in the United States, people who are more left-leaning politically, what we call liberals in the United States, primarily value the moral foundations of care and fairness, whereas conservatives, they care about care and fairness as well, but they care about them less than liberals do, and they also care a great deal about the other moral foundations. So in this video, I'm just going to focus on care and fairness. And the reason for that is number one, because these are the two moral foundations that nearly everyone, regardless of their political persuasion, agrees are an important component of morality. And also, just for practical reasons, these two foundations are the ones that have been best studied in non-human animals. So there's the most to talk about there. Although, honestly, I think you can make a good case that all of the moral foundations have at least some parallels in non-human animals. So first, let's talk about the moral foundation of care, which is essentially empathy. There is actually a ton of compelling evidence that empathy is not unique to humans. This has been particularly well studied in rats. Actually, I made a YouTube short a while ago about the sense of empathy in rats. But I'll just recap it here. So basically, scientists have known for a long time that rats will go out of their way to rescue another rat in distress. So for example, if you put a rat in a restraining device or you put them in a pool of water that they can't escape from, and you give another rat the opportunity to open the restraining device or to open a door that lets the other rat out of the pool of water, they'll do that. And they'll do that even if they don't know the other rat, and even if they have no opportunity to interact with them after rescuing them. So it's not that they're just selfishly motivated by a desire for social interaction. And in one experiment, researchers put one rat in a restraining device, and in another identical restraining device, they put 5 chocolate chips. And then they give another rat the option to open either of the 2 restraining devices. And what they found is that more than 50% of the time, the rats chose to free the other rat first and then open the other restraining device and share the chocolate with them, rather than keeping all of the chocolate for themselves. And in another experiment, rats were trained to press a lever to get food, but then they saw that pressing the lever to get food would cause another rat to get an electric shock. And the rats actually refused to press the lever to get food, preferring to go hungry rather than cause pain to another rat. Another really intriguing study that came out earlier this year found that mice perform a kind of first aid to try to revive other mice who are unconscious. So researchers put an unconscious mouse back in their cage, and then what they observed is that the unconscious mouse's cage mate would first sniff them and then start grooming them, and then if they didn't wake up, they started forcefully trying to open the unconscious mouse's mouth and pull their tongue to the side. And when the researchers looked at what they were doing with a high-speed camera, they found that the mouse was actually opening the other mouse's airway. And in one case, it turned out that the unconscious mouse actually had a foreign object in their mouth, and the other mouse removed that object. And they kept doing this behavior until the other mouse woke up. And when the researchers looked at the mice's brains, what they found is that this behavior was dependent on the hormone oxytocin, which is really important for empathetic behavior in humans and other mammals. And it also involved the same brain regions that are involved in empathetic behavior in humans. Another really cool example of empathetic behavior in non-human animals comes from a study of captive chimpanzees. So researchers put 2 chimpanzees in a setup where they basically had one enclosure with chimpanzee A, another enclosure with chimpanzee B, and then a third enclosure with food. And all the chimpanzees could see everything that was going on. But chimpanzee A had no way to access chimpanzee B's enclosure or to access the enclosure with the food. Whereas chimpanzee B could get into the enclosure with the food if they could get through a doorway that connected their enclosure to the food chamber. But the problem was that that doorway was closed with a chain, and the only way to open the doorway is if chimpanzee A pulled on the chain. So basically, the only way that chimpanzee B could get the food is if chimpanzee A opened the door to help them. But chimpanzee A would stand to gain nothing by doing that because there was no way for chimpanzee B to share the food with them. And what happened was that even though chimpanzee A never had any opportunity to access the food themselves, they still chose to help chimpanzee B by opening the door and letting them get the food, even though chimp A and chimp B weren't related to each other. Another way that animals frequently show empathy is by consoling one another when somebody's in distress. So for example, a lot of non-human primates like chimpanzees, bonobos, and Tonkean macaques, just to name a few, will console one another after somebody has been in a fight. So for example, after an individual has been in a fight, their social companions might come up to them, groom them, hug them, etc., spend time with them as a way of consoling them. And we see this kind of behavior in other animals as well. So for example, it's been found in dogs, wolves, ravens, and rooks, which are another member of the crow family. It also exists in elephants. Now, elephants, unlike primates, are relatively peaceful, so it's actually pretty rare to observe fights among elephants, especially among females. But one study found that when Asian elephants were distressed for some other reason, usually because of some kind of disturbance, other members of the herd would come up to them and they would call to them, they would touch them with their trunk, they would engage in behavior that is usually involved in bonding in elephants to basically console them after they exhibited distress. Now, you might think that empathy is something that's only restricted to mammals or maybe mammals and birds, but actually there's growing evidence that some fish are capable of empathy too. So for example, a 2023 study found that zebrafish exhibit emotional contagion, which is the most fundamental form of empathy. Basically, emotional contagion is where you reflect the emotions of another individual. So when somebody near you is feeling sad, you feel sad. When somebody is feeling happy, you feel happy, etc. So in this experiment, scientists set up two tanks side by side, each of which had one zebrafish in it, and they put some alarm pheromone into one of the tanks. Alarm pheromone is a chemical that zebrafish release when they're injured, so it's sort of indicative of the presence of a predator. And the fish in the tank with the alarm pheromone started exhibiting anti-predator behavior, so they started swimming erratically and exhibiting freezing behavior, which is how zebrafish escape predators. Now, the fish in the other tank couldn't smell the alarm pheromone because it was in a separate tank, but they could still see the behavior of the other fish. And when they saw this fish reacting as if there was a predator present, they started exhibiting freezing behavior too. Now, you could argue that maybe this isn't emotional contagion. Maybe the fish are just copying each other's behavior. But the researchers actually presented a lot of evidence that there is an emotional component to this. So for example, this behavior depended on the hormone oxytocin, which, as I mentioned earlier, is critical for empathetic behavior in mammals as well. So when the researchers did this experiment with fish who were genetically engineered to be incapable of producing oxytocin, they didn't exhibit the freezing behavior in response to seeing another fish freeze. And when the researchers injected oxytocin into their brains, the fish actually did exhibit that behavior. So basically, oxytocin was necessary and sufficient for emotional contagion. And not only that, but the parts of the fish's brains that were involved in this behavior were homologous to the parts of the brain that are involved in empathy in mammals. Homologous just means that they're basically derived evolutionarily from the same source. So essentially, the fish equivalent of the part of the brain that's involved in empathy in mammals. Also, similarly to many other empathetic animals, including humans, the zebrafish exhibited a stronger response when the distressed individual was someone that they knew compared to when it was a fish that they had never met before. But here's a really interesting part. When the zebrafish saw another fish in distress, they swam toward them, and in fact, they were more likely to swim towards a distressed fish than somebody who had not been in distress. And this is kind of surprising because if somebody is exhibiting distress, especially, anti-predator behavior, that suggests that there might be a predator in the vicinity. So swimming toward them might actually put yourself at risk. So why would the zebrafish do this? Well, a previous study found that when zebrafish are in close proximity to one another, it actually reduces their stress levels, like physiologically. And the researchers proposed that actually what the fish might be doing is engaging in consoling behavior similar to primates and dogs and elephants. Now, we still need more research to confirm that this is the case, but if it is, it would really force us to revise a lot of preconceived notions about which animals are capable of complex behavior like empathy and consolation. Okay, so there's pretty compelling evidence that many non-human animals are capable of empathy. But what about fairness? Now, fairness is actually a lot more controversial because the evidence is kind of all over the place. Now, when we think about fairness in the context of morality, what I think most of us are thinking about is having a sense of fairness in terms of how others should be treated. But before you can care about others being treated fairly, you first have to have a concept of what fairness is. And so the simplest form of that is caring about being treated fairly yourself. So one of the first studies to examine whether non-human animals have a concept of fairness was a paper that came out in 2003 on brown capuchin monkeys. So in this experiment, researchers trained capuchin monkeys to return a token in exchange for food. I think in this case, the token was a rock. So when they handed the rock back, they would get some food in return, and they could get either a slice of cucumber or a grape. Now, capuchin monkeys like grapes a lot more than cucumbers. And when both monkeys were given cucumbers in exchange for returning the token, they would both happily eat the cucumber. But when one monkey got a grape and the other got a cucumber, the monkey who got the cucumber would refuse to eat it and would often throw it out of the cage or throw it at the experimenter. So clearly they were really upset that they got a cucumber when the other monkey got a grape, which is a much more highly valued reward. Now, there's two possible interpretations for this. One interpretation is that the monkeys genuinely do have a sense of fairness, at least when it comes to their own treatment, and that they were basically rejecting the cucumber because they were like, hey, that's not fair, the other monkey got a grape. But the other potential explanation is that the monkeys don't really care about what the other monkey got per se, but rather, when they saw that a grape was a possibility, they were disappointed that they didn't get the best possible reward, and so they were throwing a temper tantrum because they were trying to maximize their own benefit. So to distinguish between these two possibilities, the researchers did a control where they put a monkey in a cage next to an empty cage, and they put a grape in the empty cage, and then gave the monkey a cucumber in exchange for returning the token. And in this case, the monkeys would happily eat the cucumber. So that suggests that they're not just disappointed that they didn't get the best possible reward, but rather they're specifically comparing their own payoff to the payoff of their companion, and that they have a sense of fairness about how they're being treated relative to others. So since this experiment came out, a lot of other studies have found similar results in capuchin monkeys, in chimpanzees, in other primates, and also in non-primates as well, like dogs, ravens, and crows. But at the same time, even more studies have failed to replicate these results, often with the same species. So often what these studies would find is that just like the original capuchin study, when animals received a lesser reward than their companion, they would reject it. But unlike the original capuchin study, when the animals received a lesser reward than what was placed in an empty cage next to them, they would also refuse the lesser reward. And so that suggests that the animals were acting out of a sense of disappointment rather than a sense of fairness per se. So how do we make sense of these conflicting results? Well, last year, a group of researchers did something called a meta-analysis, which basically means they took a whole bunch of studies like the original capuchin study, and they analyzed all of the data together to see what the overall pattern was across all these studies. And what they found is that across all these studies taken together, there was no evidence that animals were acting out of a sense of fairness, but there was evidence that they were acting out of disappointment at not getting the biggest possible reward. So does that mean that animals don't have a sense of fairness after all? Well, not so fast. Some researchers have argued that the way that the meta-analysis interpreted evidence for the fairness hypothesis versus the disappointment hypothesis was incorrect. For example, some studies have found that animals rejected the lesser reward when the experimenter put the greater reward in the empty cage. But when the rewards were distributed by a machine rather than a human experimenter, the animals would happily eat the lesser reward. Now, the authors of the meta-analysis interpreted this as evidence of quote-unquote social disappointment. In other words, the animals were disappointed by the actions of the experimenter rather than by the food they got per se, but they still didn't care about whether they were being treated fairly relative to the other animal. But some scientists have argued that social disappointment actually is evidence that animals care about fairness. It's just that they're primarily focused on whether the experimenter treated them fairly, rather than being focused on what their companion got. And if the authors of the meta-analysis had considered social disappointment as evidence for having a sense of fairness, then they might have come away with completely different conclusions. Okay, but regardless of whether animals care about being treated fairly themselves, that's still only tangentially relevant to morality. What's really relevant is whether animals care about others being treated fairly. And here, again, the evidence is really mixed. So one study gave capuchins two different tokens. If they returned one token, then they would get fed themselves. And if they returned the other token, then they would get the same amount of food for themselves. But in addition to that, it would also provide food to another monkey. And the researchers found that the capuchins significantly preferred to return the token that fed both themselves and the other individual, rather than only feeding themselves. In another study, researchers put two capuchins in side-by-side cages, and there were two trays in front of the cages. So only one of the capuchins had access to a handle that they could use to pull the trays toward them, and once they did that, both capuchins would be able to reach the trays. But one tray had celery in front of the capuchin who had access to the handle, and celery in front of the other passive capuchin. And the other tray, again, had celery in front of the capuchin who had access to the handle, but it had a marshmallow in front of the passive capuchin. Now, just like human children, capuchin monkeys strongly prefer marshmallows to celery. And so the idea here was that the monkey who had access to pulling the trays would only ever get celery themselves, no matter what they did. But they had the option to either provide the same reward to their companion or to provide them with a better reward, something that was actually better than what they got themselves. And what they found is that the capuchins actually preferred to pull the tray that would give their companion a marshmallow, even though they only ever got celery themselves. Now, I suppose you could argue that this is actually better evidence for empathy than it is for fairness, since actually what the capuchins were doing is providing their companion with an unfairly good reward. relative to what they got themselves. But regardless, this certainly suggests that capuchins care about giving to one another. And other similar studies have also found that several other species of primates and some non-primates, like rats, care about providing food to other individuals. So they'd rather give food to both themselves and somebody else rather than just taking food for themselves. But these studies have not been consistently replicated. So a lot of other studies with similar methodologies and the same species have found just the opposite. And in the studies with two animals receiving unequal pay for performing the same task, nobody has ever observed the animal who got the better reward trying to share it with their less fortunate companion. Hey, this is Future Mickey coming in to tell you about a study that I can't believe I forgot to include when I originally filmed this video. So this study was done on chimpanzees and was very similar in concept to the original Capuchin study. So basically chimps were trained to return a token in exchange for food, and they could either get a low quality food, in this case it was a piece of carrot, or a high quality food, which was a grape. But the really interesting thing in this study is that they found that the chimps actually were more likely to refuse a high quality reward when their companion got a low quality reward than when their companion also got a high quality reward. So in other words, they were refusing unequal pay when they got something that was better than what their companion got. Now, this could be because they cared about their companion's well-being and wanted them to be treated fairly, or it could possibly be because they were afraid that the companion might retaliate against them later by basically taking out their frustration on them. But either way, it suggests that the chimpanzees understood whether other individuals were being treated fairly and paid attention to that and cared about it. Now, with that said, other studies on chimps have not found this effect. So these conflicting results are a little hard to interpret, and basically the bottom line is that the jury is still out about whether non-human animals have a sense of fairness, and if they do, to what extent it matters to them and in what contexts. One thing I think is really important to keep in mind, though, is that all of these studies have been done with captive individuals in labs or zoos. And we need to be really cautious about making sweeping conclusions about animals in captivity, because frankly, if you were trying to study human behavior and you only ever studied prison populations, you get a pretty skewed idea of how humans behave. And the same is true of animals. If you only study captive individuals who have spent their entire life in a cage, you're not really getting an accurate picture of how this species behaves in the wild. Okay, so if we really want to understand whether animals have anything resembling a sense of morality, we really need to understand how they behave in the wild. And also, having a sense of empathy and potentially a sense of fairness is all well and good, but that's only a component of morality. Morality is more than just the moral foundations or the emotional underpinnings of our sense of right and wrong. It's also a social system, right? It's like a set of societal rules that individuals abide by in order to maintain social harmony. So is there any evidence that animals have social norms that they enforce and abide by in the wild? Well, actually, yes. One potential example is vampire bats. So as their name would suggest, vampire bats feed by drinking the blood of other animals, and they need to eat at least every 70 hours or they'll starve to death. But sometimes they're not able to find food, and so when that happens, they go back to their roost and they'll beg for food from another bat, and often the other bat will regurgitate some blood and share it with the bat who didn't get any. But if you beg for food from another bat, you're expected to return the favor at some point in the future, and bats will stop sharing food with other bats who don't share with them. So it's a system of social support built on reciprocity, and when individuals don't play by the rules, the system breaks down. Another example of social norms in non-human animals is found in social members of the dog family, so animals like dogs, wolves, and coyotes. Now, when these animals play, and I'm sure if you have dogs, you've seen it a million times, they do this sort of play bow where they lower their head and their forelegs to the ground, and that indicates that their behavior is play and not serious aggression. But when you're playing and you engage in a play bow, there are certain rules that you're expected to abide by. So basically, you can't play too rough. And if you're a lot bigger and stronger than the individual that you're playing with, then you're expected to kind of tone it down and not go too hard on them. And individuals who violate these rules by playing too rough get socially ostracized, so nobody else wants to play with them anymore. And actually, eventually, they'll end up leaving the group and have a higher mortality rate as a result. At least that's what's been found in coyotes. Now, these two examples, in vampire bats and in dogs, wolves, and coyotes, involve individuals punishing others for harming them personally. But in human societies, we don't just care about punishing bad behavior that impacts us personally. We also care about preventing bad behavior that harms others. And there's evidence that some non-human animals do this too. So for example, in many primate societies, dominant individuals will intervene to break up fights between others. And they do this despite the fact that there's some risk to the dominant individual of getting involved in a fight, right? Like if they jump into a fight, they could get injured themselves. And they can intervene in two different ways. So one is that they can intervene impartially, where they basically don't take anyone's side and just try to break up the fight. And the other way is that they can take the side of the underdog in the fight and basically defend them against the bully, which causes the bully to back off. Now, what's interesting is that the dominant individuals don't seem to get any direct personal benefit from intervening in this way. So, for example, one study on rhesus macaques found that dominant individuals intervening on behalf of the underdog in a fight usually were not related to the underdog. They usually didn't have any particularly strong social bond with them. And in the case of males intervening on behalf of a female, it didn't necessarily increase their chances of mating with that female. But it's been shown that in primate groups where dominant individuals intervene to break up fights more often, the group has higher social harmony and lower rates of injury. So it seems that non-human primates are policing the aggressive behavior of others specifically to enforce social harmony. So there's a lot of evidence that many non-human animals have at least some of the emotions that underpin morality in humans. And there's also a lot of evidence that many non-human animals have societal rules of behavior in their own societies that they enforce by punishing individuals who violate those rules. Whether or not this qualifies as morality is kind of up for debate and depends on how narrowly you want to define that term. But I think it's indisputable that animals' behavior falls along the same spectrum as morality in humans. But one thing that is abundantly clear is that the way that our society treats animals, especially on farms and in labs, is profoundly immoral by any reasonable definition of that term. Now, originally, I was going to include a section at the end of this video about just how morally bankrupt the animal agriculture industry is, and more importantly, what I think the solution is to that and how I think we can achieve it. But this video is already getting pretty long, so I'm just going to save that for another video. So stay tuned for that, hopefully at some point in the near future. And in the meantime, if you want to know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend watching the documentary Dominion, which I'll link in the description below. Now, I'll be totally honest with you, you're probably not going to be able to get through that documentary without at least some emotional trauma. But frankly, as hard as it is for us to watch it, it's infinitely more difficult for the animals to go through it themselves. And they go through it as a direct result of our choices, which we have the ability to change. So I think we have a moral obligation to at least watch the consequences of our actions and not bury our head in the sand and pretend that we can't do anything about it. Well, on that uplifting note, don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video. And if you want to, put your results for the Moral Foundations quiz in the comments. It'll be kind of interesting to see what people get. And if I get 25 comments of people's results, then I'll share my own results with you as well. Thanks for watching and see you next time.